Shortly after he was sworn in as the new Minister of Crown-Indigenous Relations last October, Marc Miller caught the attention of many people with a few simple but highly significant words. Quote, land theft and land back. Now, a few months into his tenure, we wanted to find out where he sees it all going. Marc Miller is the Liberal MP for Ville-Marie-le-Sud-Ouest, Île-des-Sœurs in Quebec, and he joins us now from the nation's capital. And Minister, it's great to have you back on our program. How are you doing?
Good, and thank you for having me on.
It's our pleasure. Let me just set up our conversation with this that was reported in the Toronto Star last December, and it will set up the questions to come. In his first comments in the new role this fall, Miller turned heads when he stated that it's time to give land back to Indigenous peoples. It was an invocation of an established goal of Indigenous activists pressing to reverse the damaging impacts of colonialism in this country, one of the core aims of Idle No More and other movements since. And it was a statement with potential relevance to Indigenous nations across Canada, from the Wet'suwet'en opposing a pipeline project in northern BC to the people of Attawapiskat who are hoping to acquire new land for housing in their community. Can you tell us, for starters then, what exactly those words mean to you? Land back.
Well, Steve, this is as much about what the federal government should be doing as it is about framing the conversation. Land dispossession, land theft, land fraud has occurred since the 16th century, and it goes to the basis of our relationship with Indigenous peoples. It was embodied and acknowledged in the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And if you look at the number of treaties or the treaties that we signed with Indigenous peoples and not respected, it is at the core of that discussion. It's a spiritual discussion, it's a legal discussion, and it is one that has framed a lot of the issues that we face today when we're trying to deal with issues that may seem far removed, residential schools, water. It is at the core of economic development. So the first step is acknowledging the federal government's role in the state of the reality that we face today as a country and the land that people like me live on, but also about what we need and you acknowledged it a few seconds ago about not only activists, but Indigenous leadership time and time again saying, we can't talk about self-development, self-government without talking about the land base.
Okay, you've acknowledged it. That's a big step. And I want to give you what I'm sure you've already heard as some of the feedback to that rather extraordinary statement that you made. Courtney Skye, who's a research fellow at the Yellowhead Institute, Six Nations of the Grand River, 90 minutes from this studio, said, as a Haudenosaunee person, I'm highly skeptical because I've seen the promises they make, and then I've seen the moves the Liberals make behind closed doors. I think it's more just Liberal promises that don't have the meat behind them. And there's another headline from ABTN's Nation to Nation, Miller's vow to give land back, all sizzle, no steak, question mark. Okay, that skepticism is there. How do you want to address it?
Well, I think we have to acknowledge that it exists first and foremost, that skepticism. And we've asked time and time again for Indigenous peoples to trust us and have not delivered. This is as much about us acknowledging the reality of the situation, which is highly complex. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples highlighted the challenge we face, for example, our own Crown relationship with provinces where the choice pieces of land lie within what we call, quote unquote, the provincial Crown, 90% of it in BC, for example. And the relationship we need to have with Indigenous peoples and bring the provinces and territories along in ensuring that the solutions we have for restitution and reparation include not only financial compensation where adequate and appropriate, but also the restitution of land as part of the reparations discussions that we need to have. These are difficult discussions. They're not easy discussions. I am not asking anyone, nor should anyone implicitly trust me as a result, but they have to see the willingness and the ability of the government to deliver it. But that does take a number of conversations with the private sector, with provinces and territories, various institutions within the federal government. But some of the solutions have been there for a long time, and I hesitate to point fingers at other third parties without looking inwards. The additions to reserve policy that my own department has administered has been slow at the best of times, and the solutions that we've offered to communities as part of our discussions can't be a one-size-fits-all approach. It has to be reflective of conversations, settlements usually, hopefully, outside of court. And then where land is not available, for example, the adequate compensation thereof. And that is also a set of conversations that we need to have, because too often communities have felt like they're being slow played. Those are conversations that we bring to the table, and have to have open and honestly with leadership foremost. They have been, as you've acknowledged, at the center of disputes in Six Nations, or in Wet'suwet'en territory, and they are still there, and they are not going to go away anytime soon. So I think therein lies skepticism. But extending an open hand and saying we're willing to talk about it and we're willing to have creative discussions around it, I think helps in clearing a bit of the air, but also more importantly, moving forward and achieving what we've said we want to achieve.
Okay, I appreciate your position on that. And I guess I should say I can also appreciate the fact that you don't want to negotiate with me here on television. You want to negotiate with the people who are actually at the heart of this thing. Having said that, I'm going to be a bit of their mouthpiece for the moment, in as much as there's a housing crisis in Attawapiskat. And I suspect if they were here, they would like me to try to get you to make as firm a commitment as you possibly think you can right now in saying, when can they look forward to an expansion of their territory on your watch?
And Steve, these are discussions that both Minister Haidu and I have that are ongoing with the community. Again, I would not air them in the public domain. And it's something that we acknowledged, at least publicly, with them as when we met them on the grounds of Parliament Hill a few months ago. And that is the reality of what they are requiring in a number of other situations that aren't limited to Attawapiskat. But it's something that we will do in fairness and out of respect for the community outside the public eye.
When you talk about land back, does it have to go hand in hand with self-determination? In other words, can't do one without the other?
Well, it's really a question of working at the rhythm of the community in question. It's easy to stand on the floor of the House of Commons and talk about rights recognition and self-determination. It's quite another one to go in a community and say, let's talk about this framework that we've cooked up in our own heads, and now we want to impose on you. And the community turns around and says, well, you haven't worked with us on roads, you haven't worked with us on hospitals, education, new schools, which is at the heart of some of the discussions we've had on residential schools and the legacy of that. So recognizing that there are priorities and that we have to work at the pace of communities. I know that sounds to a lot of people like slow playing, and it sounds like we're delaying things, but it's fundamentally about respect and to listening to the other side. The rights recognition framework that we've put together works in certain situations. It doesn't in others. For example, in some number treaty areas, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples provides a set of guidelines or of principles, but they're putting into place in a very practical reality is one that has to be done in partnership with the communities, in partnership with leadership. And that is something that is painstaking. It takes a lot of time, but it's actually the right way, and it's the respectful way. It's what we've heard time and time again from communities, even in coming out of a 2-year pandemic where people have been focused on keeping their own just simply alive.
Let's do a little Crown-Indigenous Relations 101 here. I know that if Canadians were to take an old Rand McNally atlas out and they looked across the country, they would see numerous references to unceded land or unceded territory. Tell us what your understanding of that means.
Yes, and there's been a lot, particularly in and around land acknowledgements. There's been a lot of question and head scratching in and around what constitutes ceded and unceded land. It goes to our own understanding of the number of treaties that were signed through Ontario and going throughout the West, as well as lands that were actually never subject to treaty, principally in the West, or have not been necessarily acknowledged as treaties as such, which probably should be in the East. So it varies wildly depending on what part of the country you're talking about. Where I come from, there are long acknowledged treaties of friendship and peace that are embodied sometimes in a non-way through wampum belts. They have not been recognized by the Crown, and they are ones that are very sacred and legal in nature for the communities. The Haudenosaunee that you mentioned, for example, are one of them. That's a process that is highly complex. I understand that for a lot of people it can be bewildering, but again, it goes to I think the point I made earlier in a different context, that we can't have a one-size-fits-all approach, because whatever the relationship and however it's been embodied, there's been some egregious behavior by the Crown, and it's important to acknowledge it. And, Canadians that are sitting, that aren't, perhaps watching your show, that aren't seized every day by Indigenous issues, can be easily confused. But I think there's a lot of eagerness to raise awareness and to raise awareness of the role and the benefits that we all have as Canadian citizens, and how that has perhaps affected Indigenous communities and grounds a lot of the legitimate claims that we hear today, and that as an outsider you can sometimes find confusing. But over the last 2 years, I've certainly felt a sense, and I've seen it at the doors, a need and a thirst of people to recognize that the relationship we've had with Indigenous peoples is torn, and the expectation from all levels of government that needs to be fixed in a way that perhaps is not yet well understood, but people want it to happen. I'm glad to be part of a government that started doing it.
Well, I guess I asked the question because I guess in some respects this adds to the complication of your job, because if you're talking about giving back, quote unquote, unceded territory that Indigenous peoples never considered to be Canadian territory to begin with, how exactly are you, quote unquote, giving land back that was never yours in the first place?
Yeah, well, it's the intellectual hypocrisy that we all bathe in as a country at times, insofar as these are lands that have been occupied. They now have third parties on it, non-Indigenous people. They have had equally Indigenous peoples that have been moved from their ancestral lands that were never actually ceded. And I think whether you're talking about the landmark Supreme Court case a quarter century ago, related to the Wet'suwet'en, whether you are talking about more recent cases related to the Chilcotin, again out west, these are important breakthroughs in actually acknowledging what went on and that we have often, as non-Indigenous peoples, forgotten. Be it as it may, the reality is that Canada looks the way it looks today. And insofar as lands cannot be restituted, or if it is impossible and communities prefer compensation, that's something we also have to move quickly on, because what we're doing is holding things back. A lot of people look at Indigenous communities and say, well, there's a lot of socioeconomic gaps. Well, those socioeconomic gaps are rooted in land theft, they're rooted in dispossession, they're rooted in displacement. And when you add up, those 3 or 4 factors and lag on and top on that residential schools, you're starting to trace a pattern of peoples that have very legitimate claims and must be recognized as such. And part of that disentangling can't be done by slicing through the so-called Gordian knot. You have to actually carefully untangle that respectfully with communities.
We've got a few minutes to go here, and I just want to see if I can touch on a couple of more things. Let me share these numbers with you, and if you think I've got them wrong, by all means correct me, but I think the state of affairs in Canada today is such that 11% of land in the country is privately owned, 41% is federal Crown land, 48% is provincial Crown land, and 0.36% is set aside as reserve status. So you're kind of in charge of a lot. Can you not just unilaterally decide, I'm in charge of 41% of the land in this country, here you go?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question or statement to have me react to. When it comes to the federal Crown land, I think people will acknowledge those are not necessarily always what would be considered as the choice pieces in and around where people would want their land back. A lot of the ones that are closer to urban centers are in fact provincial Crown land. So there's a complexity there in one part. But when it comes to the crux of the premise you asked me to work with, these are discussions that do not necessarily fall within the Minister of Crown-Indigenous Relations authorities. My ability I think if people had the power that you think I could have, I'd be a much more dangerous person than I am today. But it does take work with communities to see what is needed. When, a simple example, for example, is some of the lands that the Minister of Defence holds as part of some of their portfolio or whatever has been held by public procurement. Those are all issues that have to be worked within government with people at the table. There's some willingness, that said, but I think it's a lot more complex than saying there's 43% of the Crown land that's federal and we can just give it back to X, Y, or Z communities, because there are What we are talking about when we engage with communities is specific areas, specific claims. And often you'll find in the most complex claims, for example, in my neck of the woods, which were designated to religious orders on behalf of by Louis XIV or Louis XV, who was a 7-year-old child, for some reason decided that this should go to Sulpicians in north of Montreal. When it comes to Kanesatake, these are issues that go back many centuries and are now occupied by people who no one is, for any particular reason, is asking to leave, but does make the claims less legitimate as a result. But again, this all takes work sitting down, and there are often no simplistic answers. But when I say that, I also recognize that we can't use complexity to slow things down.
Well, for this idea of land back to work, I wonder whether in some densely populated parts of the country, some people are going to have to give up their homes or their property in order for justice to be seen to be done. What do you think?
Well, as a minister, as a federal government representative, me telling people what to do with their property, it really isn't. I would say not necessarily appropriate. What you are seeing is a groundswell of people that do acknowledge that some of the lands they've held, sometimes agricultural, sometimes residential, they want to submit that to a process where they could restitute that to the surrounding community. There's a very live discussion going on with respect to burial sites of former residential schools that through disrepair, disuse, or dispossession have fallen into private hands, and accelerating that process, making sure that goes back into community hands is something that we're currently seized of, and working with communities as they try to honor the children that never returned home. But then again, taking a step back in a greater context, you are seeing more people wanting to return land. I have heard very few Indigenous voices saying that people should be, in their turn, dispossessed. Very, very much a rarer comment to hear. Everyone wants to live in peace, and everyone realizes that no one's going anywhere. But they feel that there is some restitution and there are some repairs to be effected, and they don't want them to take forever.
Okay, Minister, let me ask you one last question, and that is, of course, there was an historic agreement made between the Liberals and the NDP for what looks like 4 years of political peace in Parliament, and I wonder whether you think that gives you the runway you need in terms of time to bring this thing to a fruitful conclusion.
Yeah, when we talk about reconciliation writ large, I think we need to acknowledge that this process will survive the Trudeau government. It will survive. It is a process that will be ongoing for some time. That said, so 3 years is a short time, relatively speaking. That said, when it comes to minority governments, what you often hear from Indigenous communities is the concern that we'll just be replaced tomorrow, and the process will have to start from scratch. So what I've heard time and time again is that that 3-year period and having that 3-year period opportunity to move on some very important pieces of issues in and around reconciliation is, to use your expression, a good chunk of runway to get some stuff done, particularly with the support that we've heard, and the NDP's been quite vocal on, whether it's Tyler Backrich, Wet'suwet'en Territory, whether it's Charlie Angus, whether it's Nikki Ashton, whether it's Gord Johns, and obviously most importantly, Laurie Idlut. They're very forceful advocates for Indigenous peoples, and I'm glad to work with them. We've been working with them, quietly to get stuff done because our interests are aligned. But when it comes to reconciliation, I don't want to make this a partisan issue, because it really should. Anyone that wants to run this country should have reconciliation on the front burner, whether they're Conservative, Green, Bloc, or NDP. And I'm not going to make that a partisan issue, but again, having that stability is helpful for us, so that we can provide comfort to communities, that we can negotiate for a time and get to a point where people feel that they're well served.
We look forward to having you back on the program when you have something positive and constructive to announce. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Steve.
That's Marc Miller, Minister of Crown-Indigenous Relations, MP from Ville-Marie-le-Sud-Ouest, Île-des-Sœurs in Quebec. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.